Hello and welcome to Video Revealed. I'm Colin Smith. By popular demand, we're going to look at a complete effects breakdown in Adobe Premiere Pro. The first thing I think you need to understand about all of the effects in Premiere Pro is you don't have to use all of them, and a lot of them are really old and cheesy. Just historically, so you understand where a lot of these kinds of effects come from, way back in the 90s, there was a lot of math that was floating around, and these ended up being made into effects, and they were dropped in almost every program out there. And a lot of them are old, and they're just, guys like me can see them coming from a mile away. They're really crappy and they're really cheesy. If you want to use them, go ahead. I think you just should shoot better video than relying on effects. So by popular demand, we're going to go through all of them, except the obsolete ones and the 360 video, the VR ones. I'll have a separate tutorial on doing that. So let's go bit by bit, and I'll pick different clips and give you an idea of what they're used for. So in the effects here, past all the presets, just into the video effects, they're organized into different categories. You can also type in here to find a certain effect. So if I typed blur, I can get all of my blurs. It's also going to show you the presets too. So we'll start in the adjust with the convolution kernel. It's also worth mentioning, anytime you see this little icon here, which you can turn on and isolate, filter just by the accelerated effects. Anytime you turn that on, anytime you see that, it tells you that that particular effect is accelerated by the GPU, which means it's going to run faster. Something like the convolution kernel does not. I'll select my clip and double click on the effect, and it applies it. And I've already done it in here, so I'll turn this on and off so you can see the results. And this is basically showing you all the different math that's going on here. And it's really easy to blow these things out. I mean, they're meant to be completely based on math, not necessarily based on aesthetics. So you can easily make something look pretty bad. But essentially, they're taking the different channels, the different pixels, and they're running math on them. And you can see this kind of an embossed kind of an effect on there. So that's the convolution kernel. Would I use it for anything? Not at all. If you want to create visual effects and colors and tints and stuff, there's much better effects for that. Adobe doesn't throw these out. They just kind of just stick them in there so you've got them. You know, somebody has concocted certain numbers in here to put it on there. I think that's way too much work. It's better to use the other ones like the Lumetri color panel. So let's get rid of that one. Let's go look at extract. So this is extract, and it has a black input level, a white input level, and then a softness value. So you can think of this almost like keying. You're trying to create a graphic that you would use for keying. So this doesn't look very good on the image, but if you needed to create transparency in something in the foreground and you had an image that was almost the right kind of contrast in terms of black and white, it just needed to be tweaked a bit, then you put the extract on there and it would extract out a luminosity channel, and then you could run a matte on that. That's what that's for. All right, levels. Well, good old levels. If you're familiar with levels inside Photoshop, this does the same thing, except it's just divided into this giant long list of settings. So this is like moving the top left of the slider. And this is the top right of the bottom right of the other slider. You know, it's so much easier to do this in the Lumetri color panel, but it's based on the same kind of things as levels. If you twirl this open, you get sliders, but you don't get the convenient sliders that you would get with a histogram, you know, understanding inside Photoshop. Okay, lighting effects. I've got a tutorial on that. You can watch that, but basically you can add these lighting effects. There's a link there for that tutorial. Proc Amp, this is just yet another kind of color correction tool. It is accelerated. It is 32-bit. Pretty much easy to understand. There's brightness and contrast. Hue, so you're spinning the hue around, and overall saturation, and you can have a split screen of the before and after of that effect. Like I said, I would never use that. I would go use the Lumetri color panel, which just is the best solution for anything when it comes to color. So that's in the adjust section. There's the camera, the blur and sharpen selection. So camera blur is not accelerated and takes an enormous amount of CPU. It's supposed to emulate the effect of a camera. It sure doesn't. There's no bokeh or on anything like that. So it's just a percentage of blur. Channel blur is blurriness in individual channels. So I'm just blurring the red channel, or I'm just blurring the green channel. And if it had an alpha channel, you could blur that and blur the edges. When you blur near the edge, you can have it repeat the edges. So as it gets near the edge, if I turn that on and off, you can see it's doing that. So it repeats all the way to the outside edge. And you can have the blur horizontal or vertical. And there's also a directional blur that does the same thing. But that's channel blur. Compound blur is a blur where you can use the blur layer from another video onto another video. So actually, let's apply the compound blur to this one, and we'll choose the video on video 2. So you see we're using that other layer to blur. I don't know how useful that is. Directional blur, let's go back to this one. Directional blur is just that. It's a blur amount and a blur direction. This is a useful one for transitions. If you blur between one layer and another, you can have it blur out and then blur to another. So put this on an adjustment layer and do that whoosh kind of blur. You got to make that sound when you're making it. So that's directional blur. This is also good on titles, graphics, anything that you want to stretch out. If you want to bring the title in, start with the blur all the way out and then tighten it up and then blur it again. Very cool. So directional blur is the first one that I would say is a good one. Of course, Gaussian blur is GPU accelerated, 32-bit. Use this for any time you're blurring. Fantastic. There used to be a fast blur both in After Effects and Premiere Pro, but fast blur wasn't as nice as Gaussian blur. So now Gaussian blur is the right one because it's GPU accelerated. Sharpen, I've got a whole tutorial on using sharpening, and you can watch that. Unsharp mask, again, watch my tutorial on sharpening. And there's a bunch of channels down here. So we get into this one with arithmetic. So you remember when I said at the beginning, in the 90s, there was all this math floating around that turned up inside a bunch of plugins. And it's funny, they were written by engineers and then given to artists, and artists had so much trouble because it wasn't like a program like Lightroom or the Lumetri color panel where you have a name like, gee, I don't know, exposure and a slider. So it's simpler to understand. This had a math. And if you look at the names of this math, an engineer would understand these right away. An artist would have no idea what some of these are. But you're basically running math on these operations in here, and you get to set all of these values. And you can clip or not clip, and we can go through all of these different values. So you can get some crazy effects in there, but you can also make a dog's breakfast. So let's get rid of that one. Blend. And what blend is doing is it's looking at another layer. So blend with whatever layer. And we've got 3 video layers. If we had 10, then you'd have 10 of these. But the next layer above is video 2, and you can crossfade between those two. So I'm setting the crossfade value between that, or the tint only. So it's tinting between the two, or darken only, or lighten only. So this is a useful one. Takes a little bit of playing around, but it's kind of like a blend mode and an opacity mode all wrapped into one. You do need 2 layers for it because you've got to go and blend it from one layer to another. So it's useful. Calculations, oh boy. These used to be called chops in Photoshop years ago. Guys that knew how to do channel operations or chops, and there was books and books and books written about chops. So the input channel, you get to tell it what is the channel that you're using and what is the second layer. The second layer is this layer. We use the RGB channel and the second layer opacity. So again, this is very much the same way where you can work between the 2 layers. What's the blending mode between the 2 layers as they interact? So it's worth playing around in here to come up with something. That's calculations. Compound arithmetic. This will help you blend the math between one layer and another, the second source layer. So you can see right there, subtract, multiply, a lot of the same kinds of things. And then how much you're blending with the original. So there's my original. I can back that off a little bit. So kind of interesting. Got a butterfly inside of that flower. Invert is invert. So whatever was white is black is white. So if you add 2 inverts, let me add another one, it goes back to the original. So invert's useful if you ever needed to convert something to a different color, if you were using an alpha channel or something like that. So it's a utility, but you wouldn't use that on a regular image. Set matte. So set matte, we're going to take the matte from video layer 2, and we can invert the matte. So this is the matte that I'm using. It's a bird flying, and it's a black and white image. So I'm applying the effect to the layer below. I'm telling it to take the matte from the second video layer, not the alpha channel though. So I'm using the luminosity of that top channel. Although it kind of might look to some people like the white bird is the thing and everything else is transparent as black. It's not. It's a black and white image, so there is no alpha channel. There's no transparency. So you take the luminosity, the black and white value, whatever's white is showing whatever is black is hidden, or you can invert the mask. So now I've got a hole going through there. So it's not making it black. If you turn on the transparency grid, you'll see that we've got a hole in there. So setting a matte is setting a matte or a mask hole in that bottom layer. And the top is just the mask. So solid composite, what this is doing is that you pick a color, and you're blending that with the bottom. So the source, the top is the image, and as I turn that down, we go to 100% of the color. And if I turn that down, we go to nothing. So you can blend part of that image into the solid color. This is one effect on one clip, but it's the equivalent of having 2 tracks with an image on one, a solid color, and you're blending the top too. So it just does it all in one. Nothing special, but useful to have. Okay, so that's all the channel stuff. Now we're into the color correction. And honestly, I will keep pushing you to the Lumetri color panel as being the place where you should go. But we're going to look at some of these other ones. So let's look at the ASC CDL. This is the American Society of Cinematographers color decision list. It's a format for the exchange of basic and primary color grading information. So the idea behind this is the ASC wanted to come up with some method of transferring basic color grading information between different systems, hardware and software. And they came up with this math. It's pretty rudimentary. It's powerful if you want. But again, we're back to numbers and sliders with names like red, slope, offset, and power. But slope, offset, and power, colorists that are coming from different color grading solutions would be used to that. But you're basically moving these around and changing those values as if you were using them on some other system. So you could take this to and from DaVinci Resolve if you wanted to, from Luster, from lots of programs. So somebody could take that or add that number in here that they had from a CDL, a color decision list, and do it that way. Useful, but hard to use. Brightness and contrast, you can easily push this too far. Again, I would never use these. I would use the Lumetri color panel. Change color. So let's go back over to this guy. So change color I've already applied to this. And if I twirl that down and turn that on and off, you can see I'm transforming the hue and changing the saturation. So I'm minusing out the saturation there. So if we change that overall hue, we're going through that. So you can view the corrected layer or the correction mask. The mask is based on this tolerance here. So it's like you're creating a key, and then that key would drive that color correction. So that's an overall change color. A change to color, I've already got on this one here. So if I turn that off, you can see the butterfly has orange. I've chosen that with my eyedropper, and then I picked the same fuchsia color of the flower. So it looks like the butterfly matches the flower. Change to color. This is a good one to have if, for instance, you needed to change a color. Sometimes you need to tone a color down or flip a color from one color to next. Everything's been shot, but somebody says, can you take that color of that shirt or that car or that sign and change that color? You can do that from here. And there's a tolerance value, and you can view the corrected matte. So again, just like before, we can change the overall matte. Because again, this is very much like keying out. So you're using a key for that. All right. Channel mixer. Again, this goes back to the early 90s where you're mixing all the channels together. And here I'm specifically working with the red green. So you'll notice that I can go minus or plus, or if I twirl this down, it's a slider where I'm going more towards the green, more towards the red. So that's the red green, and that's the red blue, and then there's red contrast. So you're adding or removing more contrast in the channel. And then you can turn this totally monochrome, and it would do just that. I mean, it's going to take the whole thing and turn it monochrome. But you can affect the monochrome because it's at the bottom with these sliders here. So you're changing the channels, but the result is monochrome on the bottom. So this is a useful one for playing around with different kinds of black and white output. Let's get rid of that one. Color balance, again, I would go back to the Lumetri color panel, but it's doing the same kind of things. You're changing the overall red color balance. So if we go to some skin tone, there's the overall red balance. So you can see what it's doing to her face. Overall blue balance. and you can preserve the overall luminosity, which is a little bit, the results are a little bit better. Color balance HSL, hue, saturation, lightness. So overall lightness values, saturation, and then the hue. So she can look like she's from Mars. Equalize. If we open up Lumetri scopes, and change the equalize value, you'll see what it's doing. That's the Photoshop style. There's also a brightness style, or there's an RGB. Horrible effect, don't use it. But it's basically stretching out the overall latitude, but Lumetri Color Panel will do that much better. It's always important to understand that there are tons of different effects and things, even on a phone, that would do these kinds of things. But the Lumetri Color Panel has incredible math inside it to give you better results. So something as simple as exposure, the Lumetri Color Panel is going to do a much better job. Let me close that up. All right, leave color. So for this one, we can leave a certain color, amount to decolor. So you can see I'm leaving her shirt. And you can either use RGB or hue. You can soften the edge. So this is the overall tolerance and softness. Again, you're cutting a key. Tint is just that. It's tint. So there's matte black 2 and matte white 2. So if you pick two different colors, let's pick a blue and a yellow. So now I'm mapping between this, and you can change the overall tint value. So at 100%, everything that was black is blue, everything that was white is yellow, and everything that's grayscale in between has a blend of that with a 50% value in the middle. Okay. The video limiter, you're not really going to see a big difference with this on this footage here. But the video limiter, is strictly for output to broadcast standards to limit the amount of video. If you're going to the web, don't worry about this. But in the broadcast world, there are hard limits, Rec 709, that you want to go to that need that kind of control. So that's the video limiter. Bunch of distortions. So corner pinning. If we apply corner pinning, let's go over to this one. If you click here, you'll see the corners, and you can manually move this around. So you can place this and distort this anywhere you want. So corner pin is useful for placing something in a phone, on a wall, on a television, where you have to stretch something out and place it over top of that. It's useful for that. It's not tracking though, so it's not going to corner pin and track if you're moving the phone. It's a static kind of thing, or you could animate each one of the corners, which is a really brutal, hard thing to do. Lens distortion, I've got a whole tutorial on that. Magnify, not a very good effect. Yikes, it's this really, really bad magnify effect. Let's put it on the clock here. I mean, it's a cheese-o-matic effect. You don't want to use this for anything. Yikes. It's just bad. Magnify, bad. You can set whether it's a circle or a square, what the magnification is. It's not a great effect. Mirror is just that. It's mirroring, and you get to set the angle. So you can flip this around and mirror something. You put it at 90 degrees, and it looks like reflective water. It's definitely a useful one. Very cool. Offset. is also incredibly useful. It will move from one side to another and keep offsetting the value. If you create something like a seamless texture in Photoshop and drop it in here and offset, then it looks like something is continuously moving and you never see that hard edge. So that's a useful one for sure. Offset is good to have. Rolling shutter repair, I've got a tutorial on that. Spherize can be useful. It's anytime you want to make something look like it's a sphere. I think this is, it's got its uses. It's pretty good quality. You set the radius and where the sphere is. Transform, I've got a whole tutorial about how to create motion blur with Transform. This is incredibly useful. The main reason Transform exists here as a separate plugin, because if we look up at the motion, all the same kinds of things are up here as they are down here. Transform is useful when you need the transform controls after an effect. And I've got a tutorial about putting a frame inside a frame and doing those kinds of things. So Transform, very, very useful. And you can have motion blur. Turbulent displace is basically moving all the pixels around, and you can set how that looks, whether it's bulging or whether it's twisting or turbulent. And then you can set the overall size of this. It's not an accelerated effect, so it does require quite a bit of CPU power, but it's useful to apply this into a texture and then use that texture to distort something else. Twirl, it's the worst effect in the world. Don't use the twirl. Twirl's ugly, horrible, hideous. People will laugh. Don't use the twirl. Warp stabilizer effect, I've got a tutorial for that. Wave warp, you can warp this in a wave, and you can set this as either sine, square, triangle, saw, circle, all these different kinds of waves. And you can set how much this is distorting. Wave warp is actually good for distortion. So if you're trying to distort the screen, so you start with a horrible distortion and then it evens out, it's very useful for that, but takes a long time to calculate. So that's everything in the distort category. Wow. Generate category, 4-color gradient. And I've got a tutorial on how you can use this, but basically you're picking the 4 quadrants of this and what the colors are. So when you pick a different color, you'll see it show up in there. So how you can blend this, you want to blend this as add, multiply. So I'm blending it on the image itself and how much I'm blending. So this again is like that solid composite. It's the equivalent of having one track mixing to another track, and the bottom track has a changeable 4-color gradient, which you could animate the positions of that. That's useful. A cell pattern, this is just some old ass code that has just been hanging around, somebody created, and I mean, you could add this as a texture, but I would never use it. Checkerboard, I would use this for an effect. If I wanted to create the a feeling of having Photoshop style transparency. So if I turn this up here and I wanted to do an alpha channel in front of a checkerboard, perfect for that. But again, a very stylized kind of effect. A circle, it just makes a big ugly circle. So I don't know why you wouldn't use the new graphics tools. Hey, it's an ellipse. And it makes an ellipse for you. Very slow, very old code. Eyedropper, it will allow you to select the color, sample radius, where it's sampling on the image. So it's sampling the image itself. A grid, if you want a grid. Same thing as the checkerboard. Anytime you wanted a synthetic background, perfect for that. You can change the size, the overall border, the grid, all of those kinds of things. So typical grid. Lens flare. Cheesy, 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 cheesy lens flare. The code for these lens flares has been around for over 20 years. It's cheesy. Everybody knows that it's cheesy and you can see it coming. That's why I love to use Rampant Design Tools. They've got real photographic flares that were created with real lights in an optical organic studio, much more real, and make your stuff look great. Lightning, don't use, don't. Oh my, it's been so long since I poked around in some of these effects. They should call this cheese-o-matic lighting. This is the cheesiest lighting in the world. Paint bucket is just that. It's filling with a color. And again, this is kind of like having a key that fills with a color. So the keys are not really good. It's if you want to do this stuff, do it in After Effects. A ramp is another way to say a gradient. So we could pick different colors and create a gradient. Good for having to stick on a background. The write-on effect, I'm not even going to double click on it because it's so brutally slow. Even on a wicked fast computer here, write-on hasn't been redone as 64-bit. It's old-ass 32-bit code. The idea behind it is you have a word and the word exposes it. I've got a tutorial, a much better way to do that in After Effects. Don't be scared. It's not that hard. It's actually faster to go to After Effects, complete it, and come back in Premiere Pro than to make it completely in Premiere Pro. That's how slow the write-on effect is. I kid you not. Okay. Whew, we're going through a lot of effects here. So the GoPro VR stuff, again, all the immersive video I'm not going to do here. I'm going to do another different one with all of that. Black and white is just that. It makes an image black and white. Color balance is red, green, and blue color balance between the two. Again, use the Lumetri color panel. Color pass means it's going to allow a certain color to pass, and what the similarity is. I don't even like this effect. Delete. Color replace, you can use to pick a color and replace it. So let's color replace, we can replace with that color and another color, and I hate these things. They're so unruly, that's why I don't use them. So forget that one. Gamma correction. Well, back in the days when someone needed to correct the gamma, they needed a gamma correction. So there you go. Gamma correction if you needed gamma correction. Keying, there's lots of different keying in here. Just show you really quick. The Ultra Keyer, I think it's not as good as After Effects, but it's pretty darn good. I'll set this on aggressive and we'll key out. Oops. And we'll key her out. I have a much better tutorial on using the keying tools, the Ultra Keyer in Premiere Pro here. So the alpha adjust, we could change the overall opacity. So we're affecting that image here, but we're changing the, so if I turn my transparency grid, I can tell it to ignore that, invert the alpha, so it's the opposite, just the mask only. So now we've got that kind of a look going on, and I can change that value here. So the adjust alpha is for something that does have alpha. So because we're keying her out, we have alpha. What's alpha? It's transparency. Watch my tutorial on talking about all of that stuff. Color key. So let's take off Ultra, the color key. Again, these are all a bunch of different keys. And they're really horrible. I mean, yikes, that's bad keying right there. So difference matte, image matte, luma matte, non-red, remove matte, all of those are just different kinds of keys, and they're not great. That's why people don't use them. They're either using the Ultra Keyer here, or most are using a different solution like After Effects or a third-party tool. Track matte key, I've got a whole tutorial about using the track matte key, but basically the idea behind here is, as I mentioned, I've got a black and white of this bird here. I'll stick the track matte key on her, and I will choose video 2, and choose the Luma Matte. There we go. So now she's inside that flying bird. So that's the track matte key. Watch my tutorial on that. I think it's much better. The Ultra Keyer, watch my tutorial on that. Neat video, I've got a whole tutorial on that. That is not standard, that's something I added. Removing dust and scratches. This is dust and scratches. It will get rid of dust and scratches, but it does soften things up quite a bit. It's not GPU accelerated and would take forever to, wow. Wow. That is a slow ass. Like I said, some of these effects have not been updated in decades, and they're so slow. I can't even delete this effect. Median, again, another slow one. Basically, median is reducing the amount of pixels needed to create that. It's an averaging bit of mathematics that does this. It's not blurring. It's almost as if it's the opposite of blurring. It's consolidating all the pixels. And when you get up to a certain point, then you end up with a really simplified version of the image. Unbelievably slow to calculate. Noise. This adds noise. Don't use it. It looks so cheap. I'll show you in a second what to use. This noise, real noise doesn't do that. Real noise doesn't just sit there and vibrate. Real noise is affected by the actual luminosity of the image. So don't use noise. Bad. Noise alpha. That's only if we've got alpha. We don't got an alpha. Noise HLS, which is hue, saturation, lightness. So how much is in the lightness? This looks much better, but it doesn't move. By default, noise HLS is just noise that sits there and just, it's bad. So instead, noise HLS auto, you'll see it move around the image. And if we tell it to be right here, grain instead. And I'm really blowing it up, but you get the idea. This noise is much better. It's not GPU accelerated. It takes forever. All of the obsolete ones in here, I do still have some tutorials using them, but they're obsolete for a reason. They're not needed anymore. They've been superseded by much better plugins, especially the Lumetri color panel takes care of so many of these. And they won't be updated. They're just old code that will just eventually die. Adobe usually leaves these in here for anybody that has an old project where they need to get the effects, but eventually they will be gone. So don't count on the obsolete ones. Perspective, I've got a whole tutorial on the basic 3D, but the understanding behind this is you're swiveling things around in 3D, and you can show a fake specular highlight on there so you see the highlight as that moves. It's okay. It's a little bit cheesy. You can use this on titles. After Effects three-dimensional motion, real 3D motion is just much better, much accurate. Bevel alpha, yikes. This be bad, 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 cheese-o-matic stuff. It's such a horrible bevel that you actually see all these different iterations of the image. Bevel edges is better. It's pretty fast, and you can set what the angle is. So it's got its uses. Drop shadow only works if you have a real drop shadows like drop shadow in Photoshop. You have to have something with transparent edges. So if you had a picture-in-picture, you could drop that on. Radial shadow, the same thing. So those are in the perspective. Stylize, these are like really bad, ugly effects. If you never went in here, just don't. I'm going to go through these. These are horrible and ugly, and they've been here for 20 years, and they're just bad. Alpha glow is only going to work, again, if we have an alpha on something. I'll put a clip on here, alpha glow. See, I'm supposed to put a glow on there. on the alpha, and there's an alpha on that. It's not even showing up. That's why I hate these. Oh yeah. Now I'll use a face for this. Brush strokes. And it's video and it's got brush strokes. Don't be fooled by these effects. It doesn't look like brush strokes at all. It's supposed to look like brush strokes. Color emboss. Again, you see how slow these things are. So if you're creating a color emboss, how much the relief is on here. Oh, it's a horrible effect. And then regular emboss, which again uses just offset math of the channels. And the very first time you might see this, you might think this is cool. It was probably cool in 1992. And after that, that was it. Find edges. It's another old effect. Can actually be useful for some visual effects techniques. You can set how much, how that's finding the edges of something. I don't think in Premiere Pro it's that useful. Mosaic is useful, definitely, if you're trying to blur things out. Mosaic can be used. Posterize is just doing that. It's reducing the amount of colors. So normally if we've got 256 levels and you take this down to 3, now there's 3 levels between those colors and it chops things off. It's a very stylized effect. It's not an artistic effect. You might think, hey, that makes it look like a cartoon. But that's an insult to an artist that creates cartoons, because the work they do with an animated face or a person like this, they would take much more care than slamming on an effect. So don't be fooled by that. Replicate. This is definitely a useful one. It does just that. It replicates how many of these instead of having to duplicate a bunch of layers. Roughen edges, just don't even. Here you can set it to roughen or cut or spiky or how much in the border, and it's, again, another cheesy effect. I would never use this. Solarize. Oops. Solarize, just why? Cheesy effect. Strobe light. My daughter taught me a really good effect to use this in, and I've got a great tutorial on how to use the strobe light. Very useful. Texturizer. Okay, so for this, I've got a Photoshop texture on the track above, and I have it turned off. I'll use that as the texture layer. And here I can set the light direction. I can set the texture contrast. And now it looks like a video playing on a wall. That's a useful one. Texturizer is definitely good. Other than that, stay away from stylize. Time. If we echo the time, so you've got multiple iterations of this. I've got a much more useful tutorial about doing these kinds of things, echoing time. Posterize time. This one actually is useful. Let's stretch that out. Right now, this is 30 frames a second, but if I take this to 3 frames a second, watch what happens. Now it looks like a bunch of stills. Very, very useful. So that's posterize time. In the transform section, there's the crop. Very useful for cropping things out. So as I move that away, it'll crop out. This is great for a garbage mask kind of cropping, or for cutting off one layer from another, or even animating a reveal. Very good. Edge feather is if something has an edge and you can feather that out. That's useful to have. horizontal flip and vertical flip. I was doing a very long edit with someone, and it was a bunch of interviews of a bunch of people, and the director wanted the first person to be facing this way and the second person to be facing that way. But each person was recorded one way. So I had to use the horizontal flip, because every single time I flipped the other way. So that's a useful one. Vertical flip, useful too, but it's going the other way. Vertical flipping the other way. Then there's a bunch of transitions in here, which are just that. They're ways to have transitions between. So you're adding a transition on a clip instead of between a clip. And there's gradient wipe, linear wipe, radial, Venetian blinds. Utility for a Cineon converter. So if you're converting from the Cineon format, there are certain settings in here on how you're changing that from linear to log and log to log, and however that works. Only if you're working with the Cineon footage. And then there's a bunch here for clip name. So it'll put the name of the clip here. SDR conform. So if we'll conform this to SDR, again, only if you're going from those formats and you need that. Simple text, you could stick some text on the screen. You can edit the text and hey now. And it's hey now. I don't know why you wouldn't just use the new graphics and the time code that you can place on there. Okay. Hopefully if you walk away with this one understanding, effects are not going to make your video look better. Effects can help you in certain areas, but don't rely on them. Don't look at your video and wonder why it's lacking and then think, I'm gonna go get some effects and make it look great. It won't. It'll just make something look worse. Shoot better, light better, get better sound, and rely on effects only when they're needed. All right, there you go. By popular demand, I went through every freaking one of the effects. I will have a future one on the virtual reality 360 video ones. As I mentioned throughout, I've got tons of tutorials on the useful effects that are there. If you're new to Video Revealed, take a moment and subscribe. You want to support us some more, we've made it very, very easy to support us through PayPal on the main channel page. One click will allow you to donate once or monthly, as little as $1 a month. You can use your credit card or your debit card. Till next time, I'm Colin Smith, and I'm the guy that's going to pull you back and stop you from relying on effects.